thank you all for being here. I'm Laura Rockwood, formerly with the IAEA, currently the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And I think we not only have a really interesting subject to discuss, but a very good panel of interested and engaged people. And I have decided that, given that we only have 3 speakers, that I will give them up to 10 minutes and then the hook, so that we have enough time for people to ask questions or to engage in a discussion. I think sanctions and the efficacy of sanctions is something that's been touched on in many of the sessions we've already had so far. And I myself am still, after all these years, still consider myself a student of sanctions. And I'm very interested in hearing what our 3 colleagues have to say about sanctions. And we're going to start off with Tarja Kronberg, then we will have Charlotte speak, and then Siko. Tarja, as you know, is with CIPRI and a former member of the European Parliament, and she's done a lot of work on the Iran case. So Tarja, I'm going to give you the floor first.
Thank you. And I'm going to start with trying to specify the impact of sanctions, and particularly the US-EU coordinated sanctions that were approved in 2012 and in effect in 2012-13, and try to specify what was the effect on the Iran deal. I mean, actually, how did the sanctions impact the deal? The second thing I would like to do, I have looked at the EU policies and followed the EU foreign policy in terms of sanctions, and I'll try to raise some of the questions that are related to EU's sanctions policy and which on the basis of Iran case can sort of be further elaborated and should be discussed and maybe having an impact on the sanctions policy of the future. And since Laura has been so good and given us 10 minutes instead of 5, I will also take up 2 issues which are now plaguing the implementation phase. And just to remind you that sanctions are not only sanctions during the negotiations until the deal, but sanctions exist also after the deal. So my first question is, what was the impact of the EU-US sanctions on the Iran deal? And there's this common wisdom that the sanctions brought Iran to the table. And this is not true, for the simple reason that Iran was, at 2012, Iran already was at the table. There were secret negotiations mediated by the Sultan of Oman, and in 2011, the US and Iran agreed to continue negotiations, and actually not only on bilateral level, but within the context of P5+1. And so the agreement was made before the sanctions, and actually it was dependent on one factor, and that was the Obama administration's policy change. The zero enrichment policy, which had been prevailing all the time during the Bush administration, also in the first phase of the Obama administration, was actually cancelled, and Obama, through the Sultan of Oman, indicated to the Iranians that a small-scale pilot enrichment would be possible. And also the idea of having to suspend enrichment before negotiations was taken off the table. So the policy change was the reason for Iran to come to the table. Secondly, the question, I think we can say that the political will, and the political will of the 2 presidents, Obama first and President Rouhani, who was elected in the summer of 2013, was the critical thing. Without this political will, I would say that the deal would not have been possible. Now, the sanctions did have an effect on this political will. First of all, or mainly because in the Iranian elections in 2013, the sanctions or the economy, the bad situation of Iranian economy was on the table as an issue in the elections, And Rouhani actually said that he would fix the economy, and here also the sanctions. So you can say that while the policy change of Obama was the reason for negotiations and the most important thing that achieved the deal, the political will was the second one, and within this political will, the sanctions did have an impact. So, and the interesting part is now that the Iranian population is, of course, expecting now economic advantages from the sanctions relief, which is an important part. And so far, this has not been forthcoming, and this is where the life after sanctions becomes interesting. But the first test will be the presidential elections in next summer. If the reformist pragmatists win, this shows that there's still belief in the real, and if the hardliners who are using the problems with the sanctions right now to the maximum effect, if they will prevail, then we'll see the consequences for the Iran deal. But the three basic questions I would like to raise in relation to EU sanctions policy. And the first is that after 2010, the EU took a dual-track approach. It was a dual-track sanctions combined with diplomacy, and actually this was a winning alternative, but not due to the sanctions so much as due to the Obama administration's change of policy and the fact that the zero enrichment policy was abandoned. So my first comment is that when looking at the dual-track approach, you should not be just blindly looking at the sanctions, but looking at the combination, and particularly looking at the policy changes that are needed for the sanctions, for the negotiations to proceed. And I think this is, from my point of view, one of the important messages also for the North Korean case. I mean, look at the policy changes that might be necessary instead of just the sanctions. Secondly, the EU's sanctions are basically targeted on persons, targeted on decision makers, but also targeted on trying to target the program itself and try to create conditions for the changes. But in the Iran case, we had targeted sanctions against decision makers and non-targeted sanctions, economic and financial transaction sanctions, which sort of were very general. And the experience on the targeted sanction is that the Revolutionary Guards, well, first of all, the EU says that sanctions should not target the general population. It's a policy defined by the commissioners that this is not the case. The EU should not target the general population. The targeted sanctions were targeted particularly for the decision makers and particularly the Revolutionary Guards. And what has happened in the sanctions phase is that the Revolutionary Guards have actually accumulated huge amounts of wealth. They have been the profiteers of the sanctions because of the shadow economy it created, and this has meant that actually those targeted have had the most benefits of the sanctions. The second group that in Iran was not targeted, but the poor. With the exceptions of the Afghan refugees, the poor have not been suffering so much of the sanctions because of state subsidies. So the group of people in Iran that has had the toughest time with the sanctions is the middle class. And there's a study made by, now I have to get it right, International Civil Society Action Network, who documented actually that the social change potential was extremely decimated during the sanctions because of the situation of the middle class. First of all, because people have the tough time making economic needs to meet, and secondly, because the private sector was actually excluded from the economy due to the sanctions. So people became, first of all, they had several jobs, no time to participate in political or civil society activities, but also because the private sector meant that employment was only available in the state sector, and civic activities were, of course, more prohibited in the state sector. So actually, the situation has been that the democratic potential and the organization International Civil Society Action says that the democracy and the rule of law has been the main victim of the sanctions. Well, the report also underscores and states that it's the women that have borne most of the distress, and when jobs are scarce, the women have to are pushed out of the labor market and go into the domestic sphere. Girls don't have the funds to go to school, and you get child marriages, and also the question of street women, which is not very known in Muslim countries, is coming up. How many minutes do I have? One, maybe two. Okay.
1 to 2.
1 to 2. Let me summarize in 3 things, and I'll come back in the debate on what happens after the sanctions. But I think in terms of sanctions use in relation to proliferation, I would like to make 3 points. The first is that the policy changes in negotiations may be more effective than the sanctions. The sanctions are easier to do, and therefore it's very easy. I'm an old politician, so I know it's easy to approve of sanctions. Secondly, in the aftermath of the Iran deal, I think we should evaluate how effective are the sanctions targeting decision makers. As I mentioned, the Revolutionary Guards have been the beneficiaries of the sanctions. There's a whole class in Iran now called the merchants of sanctions, which have accumulated this wealth due to sanctions. So I think the EU, within the EU, we should look at this targeting of sanctions. And then the third point is related to the economic disruption caused by sanctions should translate into political pressure. This is the idea. It should create political pressure, which maybe would result to at least to the change of government policies, but maybe even on the overthrow of the government. And as I mentioned, the question of the middle class in Iran is problematic, and actually the studies document that this has been one of the main victims of the sanctions, and so the reform potential in Iran is not maybe what it should be. So I think that we have to look at the political consequences of the sanctions more than we do today. Thank you.
Thank you, Terje. Over the last week or so, I've been listening to a number of people talk about the North Korean situation. And one of the comments that was made is that sanctions sometimes can strengthen the resolve of the average person, thus shoring up support for a regime. So we hear some criticisms. One might also think of South Africa, in which it was subject to sanctions and decided, well, I'll go ahead and develop this program indigenously. So those are some of the downsides. I took a bit of a straw poll over the last day or two, asking people, what do they think of the efficacy of sanctions? Are they effective or not? And what I can say is they all said that they work, but to a greater or a lesser extent. The most common answer was, that depends. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe, Charlotta, you can tell us a little bit about what that might depend upon.
Yes, thank you very much, Laura. I will have maybe a more international law approach to these issues. I think to assess the utility of sanctions, it's useful to ask 3 questions. What are the sanctions for? To whom are they useful? And in which context are they operating? And this is where we have the most divergences between, for instance, the North Korean case and the Iranian case, as you referred very interestingly to policy changes that are needed for sanctions to have a greater effect. So what are the sanctions for? At least officially, sanctions are labeled as reactions to a breach of the non-proliferation regime, be they adopted by the United Nations Security Council or unilaterally by the US or the EU, for instance. So from that perspective, we face a first dilemma with legitimacy and intensity of sanctions. Of course, when you adopt United Nations Security Council resolutions, you have a greater legitimacy stance. But it's more difficult to have strong sanctions imposed. On the contrary, when you have sending unilateral sanctions, you can agree on stronger sanctions on a target but they are less legitimate. This is quite obvious. So how do we resolve this kind of conundrum? Law can be one of the indicators that you use with the contestations of the sanctions. And what is very interesting today with targeted sanctions is that the contestation of sanctions mainly come from individual targets. And we know very well that in the EU, since the EU Judicature has been issuing more than 100 rulings annulling the inscription of some targets on the lists, whereas the contestations by state targets are very, very, very few. Maybe I can recall one, and it was in the 80s. It was in the Lockerbie case, and it did not lead anywhere because the International Court of Justice just decided it had no jurisdiction to review the legality of sanctions. So this indicates that there is a great room of maneuver to design sanctions as far as international law is concerned, keeping in mind that humanitarian impact on the sanctions has to be contained and the impact on human rights as well. This might be one of the reasons why we discussed that over dinner last night. The EU tends to broaden the scope of the sanctions instead of targeting the sanctions because it is facing judicial contestations in front of the EU Judicature. So maybe 2 points on sanctions utility or usefulness. As you very rightly pointed to, the first point would be implementation. I mean, we can agree on stronger sanctions, for instance, in the DPRK case, after the last tests in September. But we already have a whole resolution, 2270, adopted in 2016 by United Nations Security Council, with the stronger sanctions ever sent on the DPRK. This is already backed up by unilateral sanctions by the EU and the US, broadening the scope and detailing the targets as well as the matters on which we are imposing sanctions. However, the efficiency of the sanctions go through implementation, and we are not monitoring sanctions as effectively as we could. We know that for years there is circumvention of sanctions, gold transfers, cash transfers, the maritime embargo is not respected, and also some exceptions are abused, like the trade in coal exception for the DPRK relations. We also know that for some countries, the issue is not very important. There are other more urgent topics to be dealt with, so there is no clear will to impose global sanctions on the DPRK, and this is another condition for their effectiveness. So this was one of the first points I wanted to raise, and including the fact that the United Nations Security Council announced that it will review the mandate of the monitoring team of the sanctions on DPRK next March. So this would be a nice opportunity to consider the broadening of the monitoring mandate of this team to ensure that sanctions are effectively implemented and that UN member states are enabled to implement the sanctions. There are also capabilities issues, training of customs personnel, identifying opaque structures that are built to circumvent the financial sanctions, for instance. So these are issues that can be considered. The second point on utility of sanctions is their coupling with other diplomatic tools. Clearly, sanctions are not operating in a vacuum. They are useless per se. They have to be accompanied by political dialogue with the target. So usually it goes through bilateral diplomacy, information sharing, but also the constitution of alliances, clearly, to broaden the scope of the sanctions and their efficiency. They also have to be coupled, and the Iranian example is a very good example of that, with multilateral negotiations to give the target an incentive to go back to the implementation of the regime obligations, normalization of its position, economic perspectives, such as, for instance, the economic perspectives that the EU can offer to a target with trade, for instance, agreements. I wanted to point to also very specific features of sanctions in the field of non-proliferation policy, because they are used unilateral sanctions actually, seemingly, to strengthen the multilateral regime, which is not obvious at a first sight, because unilateral measures are usually aiming at power demonstration, economic power demonstration. In our case, it seems that unilateral measures strengthening the pressure on the target are actually helping the return to the normal operation to the regime. And this was the case seemingly with Iran, but also arguably with the DPRK. I mean, they are not meant to trigger an implosion of the regime. They are meant to reinforce the regime. This is why we have this chain between the IAEA, the United Nations Security Council intervening when the IAEA is not able to verify anymore the obligations, and then unilateral sanctions backing up United Nations sanctions. And I will maybe stop there because I'm afraid I'm being too long. But the Iran Joint Common Plan of Action was very interesting in that perspective because it allowed to have a multilateral negotiation that was then linked back both to the United Nations Security Council with the resolution which endorsed the plan, but also to the non-proliferation regime as such, with the IAEA verifications and the conclusion that the general director of the IAEA has to issue in 8 years' time, saying if yes or no, Iran has effectively stopped its program. And this conclusion would extinguish the United Nations Security Council resolution, including all the sanctions. So you see that there is a whole construction that is concretely strengthening the regime, or at least aiming at strengthening the regime. So this is maybe in a broader perspective, a very specific characteristic of sanctions in this area. What I wanted to stress here is that, of course, sanctions have to be linked to the regime. If not, unilateral action and unilateral sanctions are clearly a threat to the multilateral regime as it has been set up in the 1960s. Thank you very much. And I'm really happy to answer and develop more on the points I raised.
Thank you, Charlotte. We're now going to hear from Zico van der Meer, who is a research fellow with the Netherlands Institute of International Relations. And he's been very much focused on non-conventional weapons, WMD, and cyber, which we just heard about in the last session. And prior to that, worked as a journalist. So, Zico, some of your thoughts about sanctions and effectiveness or ineffectiveness.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I want to applaud the organizers because this is one of the few panels in which men are in a minority. I think that's, well, the real gender was raised a couple few days. Great to be here in the minority. I just want to offer some opinion, some ideas to stimulate discussion. In my opinion, when you talk about sanctions as a tool for non-proliferation, it's very important to consider the conditions under which you use them. And I think sometimes that's forgotten. I think sanctions are often seen as a tool to raise the cost of proliferators. You know, it's raising the cost, and the benefits are sometimes forgotten, I think. I think one of the key issues when you think about sanctions is getting the motivation of the proliferating country right. You know, it's not about raising only the cost of proliferation. You also need to show the country, to convince the country that there's something to win. You know, there's something to win if they stop proliferating, and the sanctions will be stopped. It's not only that. It's not only well, sanctions are ended, but you should consider the motivation of the country very clearly. And I think, especially in recent years, when you look at proliferation, it's often regime survival that is involved. You know, countries are proliferating, they are building nuclear weapons. You know, if you look to North Korea, look to Iran, it's about regime survival, not only security, but also domestic policies. I think that sanctions can only work if you consider this motivation well. And you should convince the country that the regime survival will be more secure with adhering to the sanctions and giving up the proliferation than to just install sanctions and say, well, you're doing bad things and this is your punishment. So, if you look to a few examples, I think Iran, North Korea, as we mentioned already, but a few examples of what I think are successes is when indeed regime survival was threatened by the sanctions. I think Libya is a clear example. Lockerbie was already mentioned. The sanctions to Libya were not only meant for the proliferation activities of Libya, but also for terrorist support, of course. And at some moment, the sanctions became successful. At first, there was not enough international support, so they didn't work that much. But at some moment, there was enough international support, and you saw that, especially when the oil industry was targeted, and Gaddafi was supporting the wealth of his population by bringing the revenues of the oil sector to creating jobs, etc. But when he didn't have the revenues anymore, you saw definitely domestic unrest, and some revolts, terrorist attacks against the regime. And I think at that moment Libya decided, okay, the first priority is regime survival. And as long as the sanctions are here, that's a danger. So maybe, it was very convincingly made clear to Gaddafi, when you stop proliferating, when you stop supporting terrorism, your economy can flourish again, you will be a respected member of the international community again. So he had something to win with ending his bad activity, so to say. I must add, by the way, that the fact that he was killed a few years later by troops with Western support was not a very good example for future cases. But the taking into account the regime survival strategies is very important. The same for Iran, I think. Also to Iran, it was made clear that if they would stop the proliferation processes, the regime would stay there, and they could win. They could win indeed the economy. So the economy could flourish again, which would create more domestic support for the regime. And even more, it was also taken into account that part of the motivation of the nuclear program was prestige. So I think it was very, very crucial that the West accepted that Iran could keep reduced nuclear program. That was also dealing with the motivation of prestige. Then, very brief about North Korea. Apparently, clearly, the sanctions do not work in North Korea yet. And that's, I think, because we don't get the motivation of North Korea well. The North Korean regime is not caring about its population or its economy or whatever. They always have the Juche ideology of we don't want any trade with other countries. We want to be isolated. So they don't care about economic sanctions just because of isolation of the country. They don't care about economic welfare economic wealth of the population. Population is poor. We know of the very big amount of people dying in the 1990s because of hunger. The government didn't care. They do not need to be afraid for domestic unrest because, the Stalinistic system is doing very well. So if you want to have effective sanctions, think about the motivation of the state. And the motivation of the state is regime survival, because they're really afraid of foreign interventions. They also need nuclear weapons to prove to the population that the regime is protecting them from the world outside. I think if you want to have effective sanctions, threatening regime survival, you should really target the elite and create unrest among the happy few in Pyongyang that are, having all power in the country. And of course we're doing that, but it doesn't work that well yet. I mean, the elite in Pyongyang still has its Mercedes, its Rolex, its cognac, etc. So something is going wrong there. But I think really targeting at the motivation of the regime is important, an important condition. The other condition is, as I said, you should offer a carrot. You should convince the regime that they will win with, changing behavior, so the sanctions will end. And of course, especially the case of North Korea proves that, you should really get international support. I think, especially in North Korean case, you see that if not all important actors are on board, on the same page, it doesn't work. In this case, of course, China is a key factor, I think. So these are just some conditions that you should take into account when you apply sanctions. And my key message is sanctions could really be a very important tool for non-proliferation issues, but they're not easy to implement. You should really consider the motivation of the targeted states and the conditions on it. I hope that's some food for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Siko. Well, we have plenty of time for questions, conversation. What I would ask you to do is to please introduce yourself briefly. Try to keep your intervention as clear and as brief as possible, and we'll should have an interesting exchange. The young lady back here, and then Pierre.
I'm Mariana Bujarin from Harvard Kennedy School. I'm a fellow there. Thank you very much for very interesting presentations. So to pull this together somehow, my impression is that there are two aspects of sanctions. One is instrumental, which is actually getting the economic effect or political effect on the targeted country. And one is intrinsic, which is basically setting one type of behavior, which is norm following, apart from a different type of behavior, which is norm breaking. And we need something to mark these two types of behaviors. And these two parts of, or roles of sanctions might be sort of at not cross purposes, but might work differently. So what I'm hearing from Tarja is that perhaps the instrumental role of the sanctions might not really give us that much. It might backfire, in fact. It might enrich some people. There's very interesting work being done at Harvard and MIT by Jim Walsh and John Parks that demonstrates that North Korean sanctions are backfiring in the sense that North Koreans have managed to develop really more profound procurement networks in China because they're dishing out more money and getting better suppliers for their nuclear program. But yet we still seem to need them, as Charlotte had pointed out, as a reaction to the breaking of the norm. So if you have any ideas, perhaps, of how to reconcile these two purposes or roles of the sanctions more effectively. Thank you.
Thank you. Pierre?
Thank you, Laura. I think there is...
Pierre Goldschmidt.
Oh, sorry. I'm Pierre Goldschmidt with Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I think there is something that hasn't been tackled by the panel, which is important. It's the deterrence effect of sanction. And we have to draw the lessons from what happened with both Iran and Libya. In fact, Iran was found technically from an IAEA point of view in non-compliance very early in 2003. It was obvious. It took 3 years for the board to formally say that Iran was in non-compliance, and it's only later that it was referred to the Security Council. Now, this was due to, I think, some kind of misunderstanding. The IAEA statute says that when a country is found in non-compliance, the board has to refer the matter to the Security Council, which is true. But it doesn't say when it has to refer to the Security Council. And this was not, I think, in many member states, they did not realize that they had time to do that. And it's interesting that, for instance, in the case of Libya, because of the very quick and good cooperation of Libya, Libya had been found in non-compliance and was referred to the Security Council for information purpose only. So the deterrence effect of sanction, which is before sanctions take place, is very important because no one wants to be sanctioned. And one has to very quickly, when it's the case, the IAEA has to say non-compliance, because then you have this Damocles sword hanging, and then you give time for diplomacy at the time, so that the state can correct whatever was any wrongdoing in the past. And this is very important, I think, and it's more effective to try to avoid sanction by the risk of having sanction. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom?
Thank you. Tom Countryman from Washington. 3 quick comments for which I welcome your analysis. First, it is a truism that sanctions don't work until they work. The case I know best, that I was most intimately involved in, was Serbia, where the democratic opposition publicly criticized the sanctions and privately told us, keep them up, and privately told us after they defeated Milosevic that it was the right thing to do. There's great difference between a partially democratic society like Serbia, a very ambiguously democratic society like Iran, and a nasty little fascist state like North Korea in terms of the effect that the sanctions will have. The key point on Iran, for me, is not that the targeted sanctions did the job. It is that the EU's courageous decision to stop buying oil from Iran is what brought about an effective negotiation. Second point, and one that I have to deal with each day, is that although the 2 concepts are frequently confused, we make a distinction between punitive economic sanctions and strategic trade control. And most of the action of the international community and of the Security Council in the case of North Korea was first about strategic trade control, about prohibiting the transfer to North Korea of nuclear and ballistic missile materials. And if we had done a better job on that, and particularly if China had seen this as an important thing to do, we would not have gotten to the point of needing more sweeping sanctions. And it's interesting that even Resolution 2270, primarily at Chinese insistence, still predicates economic sanctions upon the need to control the flow of hard currency that can be used to buy WMD material. And the third point is, yeah, it's very true, you have to analyze what the targeted regime wants. But you also have to analyze how they see the world. And in the case of North Korea, there are 2 things that the beloved Marshal assumes. One is that he can divide the international community and that it is only a conflict between North Korea and the US, and everyone else is really on his side. And secondly, he assumes he has the strong support of the elite around him. What the European Union, and not only the European Union, but every country could do, is to challenge those assumptions, to demonstrate in a very public way that he does not have the support of the rest of the world, that he can't divide the rest of the world. And secondly, it's worthwhile to demonstrate that he has to worry harder about the elite. And that can be done by a variety of symbolic unilateral sanctions on the part of the EU and the rest of the world, where even if they don't have an immediate effect, the clear message that the elite is being targeted in North Korea can cause him to rethink his calculus. So welcome your reaction on these.
Thank you, Tom. I have quite a few people on my list. Just a second. I think very quickly we'll start with Charlotte, Siko, and then Taria.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much for these very interesting comments on the reconciliation of the 2 roles of the sanctions. I think it is important to remind that sanctions are not a magic tool in diplomacy. They are really difficult to control and to implement, and it requires a very diverse expertise. For instance, a legal expertise is not, from the start, self-evident. But in the EU case, the fact that there were so many contestations before the jurisdiction was a great hurdle to the implementation of UN sanctions. Of course, expertise is needed in economics and also in history to determine exactly not only what is the interest of the regime, but also the perceptions. I learned a lot in Seoul last week in our seminar, understanding how different the perceptions on sanctions were from the Occidental or Western side and from the Asiatic side, and especially on China, and the position they had on the effect of sanctions on their own diplomatic strategy in a long term with North Korea, their neighbor. And this is something I think that is under-evaluated today. When you look at the monitoring teams of sanctions in at the UN, these are too few people, but also too few experts actually designing the implementation of sanctions. And this can be an interesting way forward, because of course we don't want sanctions to have counter effects. It is not legitimate anymore to have sanctions which are not concretely targeting or achieving the results. But on the other hand, I have difficulties to see which more effective tool we could have in international law to express a reaction to a breach of the norm. So this might be, concrete work on the implementation, a way to reconciliate on the field, and each case, case by case, these issues. But this you need means and expertise. I mean, you need groundwork on that. From the deterrence perspective, of course, there is this effect, and it depends really on some political decisions and the use of the legal tools we have. You mentioned the margin of maneuver the Board of Governors, the IAEA, has in declaring the non-compliance. We also have the reputational effect of being under sanctions by the international community, which is really something that is feared by the targets, and we know that, even looking at North Korea, which seems to be sanctions-proof, but not that much. I mean, the reputational effect is very important. And I will just sneak in a comment on humanitarian, on the humanitarian crisis in North Korea. The crisis is going on, and we know that it has been qualified at the UN level as breaches amounting to sometimes crimes against humanity. And the very fact that the United Nations General Assembly endorsed this qualification, which we can contest, I mean, it's a political body doing that, provoked clear withdrawal from North Korea from the table of negotiations. So reputation and international respectability is something really important as part of the sanctions strategy.
Thank you. Zico?
Yeah, very interesting points. To mention a few, the deterrence effect of sanctions, I think that's important indeed. But again, it depends on the motivation of the target state. Because to some states, it may be really have a deterrent effect because they have an important international economy. They rely for part on their regime survival on the wealth of the population. But for some countries, like North Korea, doesn't work at all, I think. Because North Korea, since, well, let's say 1990, since the end of the support from the Soviet Union, the economy is very bad. So could it be even worse? Yeah, of course it could be even worse, but for the regime it's not important. So I don't think to North Korea there was any deterrent effect of sanctions. I think North Korea is very afraid of military intervention, etc. The regime change, that's what they fear most. And that's why I think their calculation is really on regime survival. And then I don't think that sanctions have a deterrent effect on that. I think you should only use the sanctions to show them that there are better ways to survive instead of building nuclear weapons, etc. And how you do that, it's difficult. You should offer them carrots, saying, okay, these sanctions are here, but do you realize that your chance for regime survival will increase if you behave more like the international community wishes? And it's difficult how to do, but I think that sanctions can play again a role in targeting this very few people in the elite. And if you could create unrest there or even convince the North Korean elite that you are trying to do that and may have success, that may be an effect of targeted sanctions that may work as a deterrent to some extent. But that's maybe a difficult construction. The difference between punitive sanctions and strategic trade control, I agree with that, but I think it's also they're both mostly in cost raising. You know, it's raising the cost for non-proliferation activities. We should not forget that should also something in offering some benefits to change the behavior, and that's, I think, often forgotten. You know, that states think, oh, we are punished, but what should we do to win? You know, to benefit from ending the sanctions? That could be communicated more clearly, maybe through diplomatic ways, and sometimes it works. And well, in the case of North Korea always nowadays says, well, we have seen Gaddafi. You know, he changed his behavior and he was killed. You've seen Ukraine. You know, they gave up their nuclear weapons, and nowadays, well, part of the country is in other hands. So it is difficult to sometimes offer the example to a state like North Korea. How can they change the benefit to be sure that their regime will survive? It's a difficult question. I don't have answers for that, but maybe someone else in the public has.
Thank you. The first question about the instrumental and the intrinsic effects of sanctions. I think there's a problem of sanctions being sometimes in cross purposes and actual every case is individual and maybe would benefit from individual analysis. I mentioned the Revolutionary Guards and the wealth accumulation in Iran, which may be different from the elite in the North Korea case. But there's some rules are important, and I think the question of regime survival has come up here, and you can see the opposite case, that if the objective of the sanctions or any program is regime change, then it's in contrast to non-proliferation goals. If you want a country to prohibit or close the nuclear program, you should not at the same time talk about regime change, because no country will negotiate its own exit. So this balance is extremely important, and I think we can learn from the Bush administration's regime change policy in relation to Iran, that while this was on and before Obama actually changed the policy, there was no chance of real negotiations. I think the question of understanding the target country is important, of course, and the question is, how do you understand the target country, and what, if you want to learn something about the mistakes we in the EU have done in terms of understanding Iran, I think one of the things is that the EU was very close to actually getting a deal in 2005 before the Americans joined in, but the problem was, and I think this is generally acknowledged, that Europeans didn't understand the strategic importance that the nuclear program had in Iran, and particularly the question of the right to enrich. And had this been actually understood, the Europeans could have had an agreement on the level of 20 centrifuges at the time. So this, I think it's important to understand the target country. It may not be so easy, so you have to try to. And I think Iran and North Korea are very different. In Iran, you had to understand what does enrichment mean to Iran. On the other hand, North Korea has nuclear weapons, and it's a completely different situation. I agree on the deterrence effect of threat of sanctions. It's quite effective, I think, and in the Iran case, the question in 2005-06 about referring Iran to the Security Council with threat of universal sanctions, I think was a real reason why Iran came up with a lot of compliance suddenly and a lot of proposals and so forth. And that, I think it was very, very effective. And I think the Security Council referred North Korea, I think it's probably not equally effective. So in the Iran case, it was effective. And I think finally the question of not being divided. I think the EU has, of course, this problem that sometimes we are divided, but in the Iran case, we actually were very, very united. And I think the fact that the US and EU could coordinate the sanction in 2011 was a surprise for the Iranians, that they actually had expected that the EU could play another role, and okay, the US was talking about banking and financial sanctions. So the fact that these two were united was important, and I think it was especially also important for the other two countries, China and Russia, in a different way, because the fact that these two countries, EU and the US, agreed on sanctions gave a very bad name for companies who were working with Iran. So there was a psychological factor against Russian, particularly, but also Chinese companies, that working with Iran was not the thing to do, and that, of course, there was a direct threat of US sanctions for companies that were working, but Chinese and Russians could go around this. But the psychological effect was there, and in fact, the sanctions were more united than you would think, because Russia and China were against unilateral sanctions.
Thank you, Tarja. I saw 3 hands over here. There was a gentleman here on the right, somebody in the middle, and one in the back. All right.
Me too.
Got you too.
It's good.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Erica Amore from the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and I coordinate a network on sanctions, and have also been involved in the production of the Sanctions app, which, if any of you don't know it, I'd encourage you to download it onto your phones and computers, which is the first comprehensive assessment of all UN targeted sanctions since 1991, and it includes a lot of detail on the effectiveness and impacts of sanctions for the purpose of non-proliferation in the cases of Iran and North Korea. I would just like to make one comment, if I may. The work that we've been carrying out recently into this field has shown that, like the point made by Charlotte, sanctions do not operate in isolation and should only be measured according to their policy aims. Secondly, the way in which they're coordinated with different other policy instruments is extremely important as well, and that's sometimes overlooked. So I think I really agree with the point that was made here. And if you look at if we break down the impacts of sanctions according to factors such as signaling disapproval over the breach of international norms, coercing behavior, and constraining behavior, we can actually find a more nuanced way in which sanctions have actually potentially been effective, particularly in the Iran case, in certain areas. So I think it adds an interesting debate to whether or not they've been working. So my point would be that it's perhaps time to stop asking if they work and rather ask how they work, under which conditions, and in combination with which types of policy instruments. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there was a gentleman to your left who had his hand up earlier.
Thank you. My name is Derito Vicente. I am from European University Institute in Florence. I have a question about, of course, North Korea. Actually, the sanctions worked at some point in the past, in 2008. For instance, in 2008, North Koreans allowed US, Russian, Chinese inspectors to verify their facilities. There was also this maneuver by the North Korean government of the Yongbyon destruction of, there was an atomic facility there. But since then, I think it's a question of trust. And I think before we starting to understand why sanctions doesn't work, I think there's a question of trust between two sides, between the so-called six-party talks members and North Korea. There was a change on the leadership, and I believe that since then there is a question of there is no trust between the parties. And my question is, what steps could be made to build up that trust that was actually destroyed? Because if we see what happened in 2008, basically you can see that the destruction of the atomic reactor in Yongbyon was basically a maneuver of the North Korean government to renew their nuclear arsenal in other parts of the country. So my question is the one that I said: what it can do to build up this trust?
Thank you. There was a woman on the aisle, please, yes? And then I'm going to shift over to the left, and then I'll come back to you guys over here on the right side.
Thanks. My name is Dina Svangeri from King's College London. Broadly speaking, I think sanctions are effective when you threaten to impose them and then when you offer the carrot of removing them. But I think Iran has been a good test case of how removing them has been quite problematic. So my question to the panel is, do you think that the EU in particular has learned any lessons from what's happened in the Iran case, and in particular from inadvertently making itself a little bit dependent on extraterritorial US sanctions? Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. I think we have Emile and then Dan over here. No, not yet. We've got people
Thank
in
you.
front of
Tara, you touched a little bit upon it.
Name?
Emile Dahl from RUSI. You did say it, Laura, so I thought I wouldn't restate it. Taya, you touched a little bit on it with the importance of having the EU on board on Iran sanctions. We have a thing called Brexit, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on if the exit of the UK from the European Union would have any effect on EU sanctions policy. Is the role of the UK overstated in EU sanctions, or will the EU continue as it's always done? I'm also thinking a little bit about the role of London played in finance and insurance, and what London can bring to a EU sanctions regime. So I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Emile. And if you could pass the microphone to Dan.
Yes, good morning. Great presentations. My name's Dan Smith from CIPRI. And I thought actually the point you were going to make is that Britain under Brexit will be the first country to sanction itself. But we'll move on. One of the themes which is running through all the presentations and several of the questions is that sanctions are about influencing behavior. But there is a huge range of influences on behavior apart from the sanctions. Right? So what's happening in Iran in the period of Ahmadinejad's presidency, which seems like an absolutely dead period as far as diplomatic possibility is concerned, is that the leadership is becoming aware that Iran is becoming actually an increasingly secular society. So it has got a real problem. The Revolutionary Guard grew in wealth, as said. You have a religious state, but an increasingly secular society. And that balancing act which they have to carry out is also a part of their calculations about what kind of relationship they need to the world, and therefore why, for example, a candidate like Rouhani might be a viable and valid candidate, because he offers a different kind of balance in that relationship to the world. And in this, I think it's extremely easy to overstate the importance of sanctions, and it's also easy to get them wrong, right? To be providing perverse incentives at the wrong part of the process of evolution in a country's policy. DPRK is a very, very different case. And I think it's really quite important not to discuss them as if there are lessons from Iran that you can put onto DPRK. I mean, Iran was a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. DPRK's evolution has been from nuclear program as a bargaining chip to we are a nuclear weapon state, get used to it. And they are thinking about regime survival in a different language and different terminology, different concepts than Iran is. Given this, the question which I have, also which you've been touching on, is what range of capacities and competences do you think are required amongst the people and the institutions who need to design the sanctions once there is some kind of political agreement that that's bad behavior and we want to sanction it?
Good question, Dan. And I'll give the floor to one more person, then we'll do another round with the speakers, and then hopefully we'll be able to take the last set of questions and comments from the group, because there still are a few more.
Yes, if we have the feeling from outside that there is no impact.
Your name, please.
Dr. Nasreddin from Lebanon. Thank you. If we have the feeling that the sanctions have not a big impact in target country, for two reasons. One is because we don't have any open source from the media, national media, about the impact on the population. The second is what you said, all of you, that since the regime itself don't have any feeling that the sanctions are endangering his life, they will continue to ignore this sanction. For example, the direct impact of sanctions on Iran and Libya was the exchange rate of the national money and the cost of life. And the population suffer a lot about this. I know some case, and mainly in Libya. For example, Libya was under sanction for years and years, and Gaddafi don't feel any time the necessity to start any discussion with the international community. Since US come to Iraq, Gaddafi feel himself that endangered, and he started to say, okay, I will stop everything, including the nuclear program, and the process, you know it very well. By the way, the nuclear program of Libya is a complete joke. There is no nuclear program. I know very well. I was Director General of the Arab Atomic Energy Agency. I know the case. There is no any nuclear program. They bought from the black market some component for enrichment. There is no natural uranium. There is no expert. All the equipment were in the box. They never start any operation of enrichment. They didn't try to see if the equipment are working or not. So it's a complete joke because of failure to find something in Iraq. The story of nuclear program in Libya is win-win joke between US and the Gaddafi regime to say, we had a big program in Libya, we stop it. And also US said, okay, we failed in Iraq, but we succeed in Libya. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor to our speakers to respond as expeditiously as possible. And then, as I said, I'll give the floor to people who have questions. I'll start with you first.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. First of all, I agree that we should not discuss whether sanctions work. We should be more interested in how they work. And this comes back to Dan's question about the capacity of the people who actually design and implement sanctions. And I think there's, of course, no rules, but you can give a few examples of necessary knowledge. For example, if you target the elites and you come with a visa ban and the people don't travel anyway, so it's not a good idea. Just you have to focus. If you have a visa ban, you have to know who travels, why, and where, and how this will affect the persons involved. The second question is that, for example, in the Iran case, there has been not enough knowledge about the state structures. The private industry has been affected more by the sanctions, and the state structures have actually benefited from the sanctions. So you have to understand the balance between the private sector and the state sector and try to design the sanctions according to your sort of target group. So it requires a lot of information about the economy and about the questions. Then I think there's one phenomenon which we have not been given enough attention to, and this is over-compliance, the fear of companies of being sanctioned. And I think the medical problems with Iran, where the medical supplies were not sanctioned, but the companies in Europe and outside felt that they might be sanctioned and there might be US sanctions on the companies working with Iran. So they refused to do anything with Iran, and therefore the lack of supplies. And there were also questions of financial transactions that were problematic. So this overcompliance is a problem, and we see it today. I go to the second question about the EU. Has EU learned anything? And the question of the removal of the sanctions, I think there was an expectation in the EU that after the removal of the sanctions, we would be free to trade with Iran. There were a lot of companies going to Iran and a lot of plans for trade deals. And then it turns out that because of the US Treasury restrictions, this is not possible. And the banks in Europe have been very fearful of going to Iran, and I think with right, because there are so many restrictions in the US system that it's very difficult to know whether you are allowed to trade or not. I'll take an example very shortly, the question of the airplanes. Both Airbus in Europe made a deal with Iran about 118 planes to be sold to Iran, and the airplanes were exempt from US sanctions, so Airbus was also going to buy 88 planes from Iran was going to buy 88 planes from Airbus. Now, because of the resentment of Iran, there was a blockage in the US trying to block this Airbus, the Boeing deal, and then the Boeing leaders went to lobby and said, well, if Boeing is going to be blocked, then also Airbus has to be blocked, and the Europeans should not be able to sell airplanes because the European airplanes contain more than 10% components from the US. So the solution in this case has been that both are now selling and both got exemptions from the US in order to be able to sell their planes to Iran. But this kind of strategic competition is going on and should be. And a short answer on the Brexit. In the Iran negotiations, there has been 3 European countries involved: France, UK, and Germany. And they have had a united front, but they have been very different in their orientation. France has been very sanctions-oriented, a hawk in the final phases, and also very much on the zero enrichment line. On the other hand, we have had Germany, which has had traditionally very good relations with Iran and has been very open to, for example, limited scale of enrichment. And we have had the UK in the middle. So with Brexit, this middle bridge is now going away, and so maybe the French and the Germans will be more polarized than they were with the UK.
Siko, quickly, and Charlotta, let's try to keep these as concise as we can, so make sure we can get the rest of the comments.
That's right. I really liked the remark on the balancing act of the regime in Iran, that they also had these domestic problems. I think that's always the case. You know, that when states are going towards a proliferation trajectory, they always have domestic reasons as well. It's not only international politics. And you should really take that into account to make sanctions, for example, with all policy, to make it effective. And that's also indeed the answer on the question, what do people need that work on sanctions? I think you really need to involve country experts that really can give insights in, okay, why is this country behaving like this? What are the several things that are happening at the same time, and combined they come to they create this policy. That's key, I think. Maybe another important thing indeed it was mentioned, the aftermath of sanctions. When you have solved the problem, you should also solve how to get the sanctions away, and to have the country that used to be sanctioned have it indeed winning. And that is a problem, you know. When sanctions are successful, you should also be aware that it should resolve well. And you see the Iran case, in which now the Iranians are complaining that they hope that their economy would go upwards quite fast, but they still have the banking problem. They still have, as you said, the over-compliance by many companies. I think there the West should really invest more in making it successful. Because now, I don't know what will happen, but at some point Iran may go backwards and say, well, we didn't win as much as we hoped. So to make it successful, you have to invest in it as well. And I already mentioned, you know, the aftermath of the sanction period of Gaddafi. Well, at first it was successful, but a couple of years later he was killed, you know. So it's not a very nice example of making sanctions successful from that perspective. Two very small details around the Libya-Iraq connection. I know that many experts say Gaddafi gave up his chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, etc., because of the invasion of Iraq. But I also know many experts that say, but actually, Gaddafi was negotiating for a long period before the invasion in Iraq already. So he wanted already a solution, and it was mainly because of the domestic unrest the sanctions created. He wanted to survive his regime, you know. It just didn't matter for him whether he would survive as being a rough state or being an accepted state in the West. He wanted to survive, that was the key. And I don't think the invasion of Iraq was that influential. And indeed, by the way, the nuclear weapon program was a joke, but the chemical weapon program less, I think. One last point on the sanctions to North Korea, 2008 you mentioned. I think you also meant the Banco Delta affair. There was one point at which sanctions were quite effective, that North Korea was really shocked. Whoa, how did they do this? When the Americans could freeze the bank accounts at the bank in Macau. So that created a window of opportunity. But I'm afraid that North Korea soon learned its lesson and thought, well, okay, we can do something now. But we can also go on the path we were having, but better. You know, even more underground activities, etc. And well, apparently that works as well. Thank you.
Charlotte.
I'll try to be brief. Erika, I couldn't agree more, so we'll do that. To my EUI colleague on the DPRK, maybe two ideas. The first is already developed by a Japanese professor of international politics, Masako Ikegami. She's drawing from trust-building measures during the Cold War and applying them to the DPRK situation. This might be an idea. Another idea is to have a look at the Iranian Joint Common Plan of Action in the way it is designed, because it's a long-term perspective of implementations, checks and balances, and I think this is something that can be at least inspiring in the way in which one can design long-term trust-building schemes. On the lessons learned and extraterritoriality, I had the chance to participate to Professor Ronzitti's book on coercive diplomacy lately, and to work on extraterritoriality. Well, I had the impression that I was navigating into really murky waters. I will not have a clear answer to you. Clearly, I don't have the sense that the EU or the EU order or the EU legal culture would allow a practice of extraterritoriality to the extent to which the US does. Clearly, as far as secondary boycotts are concerned, these can be probably envisaged in terms of the control and the controls that the targets have on the situation. Going further, I don't see that we can learn more lessons from the US sanctions to date and to the state of EU law. I mean, I don't think it's envisageable. Brexit, I have a solution. Actually, you might really not like it, but it goes back to concretely how sanctions are decided and implemented within the EU. Concretely, you have a first political decision to implement the sanctions, either if they come from the United Nations Security Council, this is a CFSP decision, or to impose unilateral measures. This is an internal decision by all the member states united in the Council. My experience at the UN when I was working on the Al-Qaeda sanctions regime showed that other states could, and this is what you will not like, align with the EU position, whether they wanted to be a member of the Union, it was the case of Croatia at that time, or to be part of a broader European perspective, it was the case of Switzerland. So it's not at all a problem for the UK, for instance, to decide and make the political decision to implement the same sanctions. It would imply coordination. And this would maybe part of the special relationship that the UK wants to build with the EU in the future. This I don't know, but I don't see a legal problem in the UK continuing to participate in the implementation of sanctions together with the EU. On the influencing, yes, on the range of capacity. My experience is that the main problem to design sanctions is the exchange of classified information. Of course, sanctions design is based on classified information. You mentioned national experts, and states are not really willing to exchange this information. So this might be an idea, cooperation within the European space, but also maybe between the EU and the US. There are some schemes to do some classified information exchanges. More concretely, perhaps, as you well know, the monitoring teams in the Sanctions Committee in the UN are very restrictive groups. They gather maybe 10 or to 15 experts maximum. So maybe enabling them to have access to outsourced expertise that would, of course, need then to be cleared and to allow for the exchange, again, of classified information. I think this is the main problem in that. Third point on capacity, the Resolution 1540 is a good example. It's on non-proliferation to non-state actors, and it has given the place to a whole implementation scheme, very deep legislative training, concrete training on borders, and this can be an inspiring example on how you can improve the capacity in the monitoring of sanctions, and it's very, very broad. Yes, that's it.
Thank you, Charlotte. I have a gentleman here, Nabila, professor, and then I'll see what we have in terms of time. I'll try to get to the other people who raised their hands as well.
Thank you. Onur Güven from the Asser Institute, The Hague. I have two brief questions. First one concerns how to end or change policies. Adopting policy is one thing, maybe challenging, but changing it or ending it may be even more challenging, both for proliferators but also for states adopting sanctions. And there may be a great deal of subjectivity in the matter. So are there examples where a state targeted state was behaving in one way as required under the sanctions regime, but that the lack of trust still obstructed a government or governments from changing or ending the sanctions regime? And the second question relates more in the broader political security situation, taking into account the sanctions between the West and Russia. Do these have negative spillover effects on the ability of the UN to impose sanctions on proliferators or potential proliferators?
Thank you.
Thank you. Charlotte, Kuwait, Ambassador of Kuwait. Kuwait has no aspiration to be a member of the European Union, but we were approached by the EU during my term here in Brussels. The EU approached member states to please associate themselves with the sanctions that were passed by the EU. So it's not only for European countries, it was widespread. So are the American sanctions that, some are more under pressure to abide by them than others. I want to go back to this title, Utility of Sanctions and Non-Proliferation, and to say that, except for one colleague referred to it en passant, and that is utility of sanctions against Iraq in non-proliferation. We did not have the patience, and I'm speaking in the general we without any identification or laying blame on anyone, of waiting for the effect of sanctions to take effect on Iraq. And in March 2003, the agency, IAEA, had to pull its inspectors from Iraq because the war was looming very high. Then we come to the question of the nuclear program on Iran, you know, and I think the incidents or the background, the Iraqi background was, has its, was clouding, you know, the whole atmosphere. No one wanted to rush to say that Iran was in non-compliance so soon, especially after the inspectors were asked to get out of Iraq, and we had the liberation, quote unquote, although according to Security Council resolutions, the powers were called the occupied powers, you know, which was an anomaly if they were freeing Iraq. So that is why I think, you know, sometimes we're patient. Who is the target? Who is involved? Who's going to say when are the sanctions going to work? Who's going to up the ante in terms of the sanctions? Is it the banks, the SWIFT account, or whatever it is? The EU was not willing to it. It was only when they were put under pressure that they agreed that the SWIFT accounts will be also part of the sanctions on Iran. I think if I say too much, I will divulge more than what I would like to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor? I'll try to get to you as well.
Thank you very much. Very nice meeting that I had a lot.
Can you please introduce
And
yourself?
my name is Ronzitti, Istituto Affari Internazionali. So the first is about sanctions as a deterrence. Yes, it's true. It's also a deterrence, but if the deterrence doesn't work, what you have? You have a form of coercive diplomacy. And the coercive diplomacy is better than using armed force in international relations. We have to think about a country that wants to destroy nuclear facility in Iran. Sanctions as coercive diplomacy are better than the use of force. The second point is about the legitimacy of sanctions. There are no problems if the sanctions are taken by the Security Council, because the Security Council is acting under Chapter 7, and usually it says that the country to be targeted is a danger for peace and international security. But what about unilateral sanctions that, from a legal point of view, is incorrect to say sanctions in this case? And the European Union is employing the term restrictive measures, because in this case you can react only if the targeted state is committing an international wrong. Otherwise, you cannot. And this is the main difference between the Security Council sanctions and countermeasures. The example can be proliferation, because sometimes a country is not responsible in international law because it's not a party to the NPT. So in this case, the Security Council can take sanctions, but not other states can have a recourse to unilateral measures against this country. And another problem that we have experienced and has been ventilated also this morning is the problem of lifting sanctions, because, for instance, in Iran, in the case of Iran, sanctions have been lifted, but at least one country still is employing unilateral measure against this country, and this as a consequence, for instance, for the relations between the European Union and Iran. Third point is about, I go very quickly, about the implementation. You have a number of instruments for the Security Council. You have the Sanctions Committee. But for instance, for the European Union, usually these sanctions are implemented through regulations. So it's a legal instruments in this case. They are implemented, otherwise there is a recourse to the Court of Justice of the European Union. Maybe a subject which has not been touched upon very much is about the cost of sanctions for the sanctioning states. And this is a discussion we have nowadays within the European Union. The cost of sanctions, for instance, against the Russian Federation for the annexation of the Crimea, and the countermeasure taken by the Russian Federation against the European Union, because one thing is to sanction North Korea. Nobody, I guess, care about the trade with North Korea. Other things is to sanction the Russian Federation. And this I finished. This is a big problem, and usually there is no recourse to some multilateral organization as WTO, because there is a security exception in this case, and it's not possible to adjudicate disputes of this kind. Thank you.
I'm going to give the floor to two more people, but you have to promise you keep it to less than a minute, okay? First to you and to you in the back, please.
Thank you. I didn't think I would make it, so appreciate it. I have a fairly technical question. Oh, sorry, Paulina Izowitz, IISS. Fairly technical, but I'll keep it brief. If you look at the case of Iran, again, if we can return to it, under the JCPOA, the US promised or decided to lift nuclear-related sanctions. But in practice, if you look at the sanctions authorities, at the executive orders, you see that it's typically nuclear and something else as rationale. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that. Probably, Charlotte, you'd be brave enough to tackle that, if anyone. Thank you.
Give it to the gentleman back there, and then we'll have a very quick wrap-up by our speakers.
Thank you. My name is Enrique de Vega. I'm a postgraduate student at the Gutiérrez Mellado Institute in Madrid, and I've been researching about sanctions as a foreign policy tool. So I couldn't agree more with Professor Busillon's point that the utility of sanctions greatly depend on whether they are universally implemented. So I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little further on how new technologies could help in ensuring monitoring and ensuring universal implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, speakers, keep it to a minute, 2 minutes if you can, okay?
Okay. On the enduring legacy of sanctions, I think we can see this, that there are problems also for those countries that have agreed to sanctions. To get sanctions removed in the US takes the Congress decision, and I think it's very difficult, and I've talked to Congress members about this, how to define the nuclear-related sanctions. It's the sanctions that have been approved at a certain point in time, but they are related also to human rights and all this. So this problem is big. On the other hand, in Iran, you have the structures that have been created in the economy during the sanctions, and this is something that's called merchants of sanctions. And I think now there is a debate in Iran whether these merchants of sanctions, they can participate in the economic rebuild of the country or not. And they are those who have the money and they could invest, but on the other hand, they are not very well seen. So these conflicts appear on both sides. I want to very briefly to say something about 2003 and Iraq. First of all, there was an expectation that after the occupation of Iraq, Iran would be the next. I think there's this slogan saying that everybody in the US, everybody can go to Baghdad, but real men go to Tehran. And it was idea that the country would collapse because of the of the Iran occupation. At the time, Iran came up with a very, very advanced proposal to the US on having discussions with the US, taking the nuclear program off the table, and also solving many other problems. And it was because the regime change policy was there, it was not it was disregarded. A very short comment that the EU policy, the EU's security strategy actually defined an alternative way of dealing with proliferation and saying that we have to have effective multilateralism, and the question is about diplomacy and not about military action. And actually the EU negotiation in 2003 had an explicit goal of avoiding military action in Iran.
One thing about Iraq was mentioned. I think Iraq is one of the best examples how sanctions do not work. You know, in the 1980s and 1990s, you know, the people were suffering, the population, while the government used this suffering to create their own status of it's the enemy outside, you know? So the propaganda misused the sanctions. A successful example of ending sanctions, the question on lifting sanctions, I think is Libya. After the sanctions ended, work is going on, you know? You don't say, okay, we stop sanctions. But Libya, well, the economy, the oil went for export again. The money was going to offering jobs to the people. So that was a successful example, I think. Although, again, Gaddafi didn't survive long. And about the Security Council resolutions, I agree. The best sanctions are when it's universally applied. But that's not always possible. And if it's not possible, then you can do unilateral things, but you should always do it in a group and have all key players on board. You know, you can't sanction North Korea unilaterally if you are EU or whatever. You need to cooperate with China because that's a key player in this case. So yes, universality is key, but if it's not working, you should keep players having a role as well. Thank you.
Charlotte.
Yes. I will be very brief. Yes, just something following up Kuwait's ambassador comment. I admit that I had an idea of the UK being a bit closer to the EU group than a third country and participating in the coordination meeting they have at the UN. So it was not very clear. On legitimacy, and Professor Ronzitti's comment, I think there is a larger room of maneuver for unilateral sanctions depending on their actual breach of previous obligations by the sender. So this gets technical and depends whether some cooperation agreements or other obligations pre-exist between the sender and the target. And this is something that has to be dealt with on a case-by-case depending on the targeted country and the sending country to know whether it can be actually justified under international law and then considered as legitimate. On new technologies, well, I have no magical answer to that. I guess something with exchange of information, clearly sharing of information would be very important, even more so for countries that have no concrete capacity and information capacity. So benefiting, or they do already benefit from some classified information, but maybe something more can be done. I think that's it. I think we will discuss maybe your question afterwards. Thank you.
Well, before I ask you to thank all of our speakers for their contributions today, just a quick couple of thoughts. It seems to me that for Security Council sanctions to be effective, one needs to reinforce consensus. Consensus is what makes these sanctions, at least ab initio, effective. One needs to articulate clear, achievable goals and strengthen negotiations, ideally multilateral. If you have targeted measures, non-proliferation sanctions can be more effective in the context of negotiations, the occasional carrot, and as the non-proliferation regime itself develops, I think the potential effectiveness of sanctions will be strengthened accordingly. we could continue this conversation for hours. It is fascinating. There's so many different views about this. And I want to personally thank each one of the speakers and to each one of you for being so engaged in this subject matter. Thank you very much.